And you're very welcome to KCWTV. Now we're approaching the final countdown for the Seanad elections. The poll itself will close on Wednesday the 27th at 11 a.m. There are 60 senators in our Seanad. 11 of them are appointed by the Taoiseach. 43 are elected from 5 special panels of nominees by an electorate consisting of TDs, senators and local councillors. And 6 senators are elected from university members, 3 from the University of Dublin and 3 by graduates of the National University of Ireland, the NUI. I've actually got with me 2 candidates who are going for any one of the 3 seats of the NUI system. With me now in studio are Senator Ronan Mullen. He's already been a member of the Seanad since he was first elected there in 2007 as an NUI campaigner, and also here Professor John Crown, an oncologist. You're both very welcome. I suppose, Ronan Mullen, you're first off with you because this is your second time round. So why should people elect you this time round?
Well, I suppose, first of all, it's one of the questions that I got asked by quite a few people. Was why aren't you running for the Dáil? You know, because all the talk about abolishing the Seanad has led to almost a certain inability of people to understand why anybody would go for the Seanad. I suppose.
And you didn't go for the Dáil?
I didn't go for the Dáil, no, because I actually do believe, I'm not saying I never will, maybe someday if it seems like the right thing to do, but we'll see what happens then. But I actually do believe in the Seanad as a chamber where you get the double scrutiny of legislation, where you get the second scrutiny, and where at its best, and I wouldn't like to be overstating the claims for the Seanad, at its best you get a quality of debate that is sometimes missing for the Dáil. In asking people to vote for me for the Seanad, well, I suppose I have a 3.5 year track record set out. I tend to take an alternative view on a range of issues, but I don't like to describe it really as such because I know that there's a large degree of support for some of the type of things that I've said.
What would be your 3 principal areas and policies that you'd like to see reform or certainly campaign for?
Right. Well, the truth is that you get a limited opportunity to really develop themes in a big way in the Seanad. I was explaining to you before we came on, for example, how an independent senator will get the right to dictate the debate once a year for private members' time. And I suppose the way I use those 3 debates so far would illustrate some of my policy concerns, by no means all of them. One, I brought forward a private member's bill that would protect human embryos from destructive research or from any research. Yes, I support adult stem cell research, of course, but I would believe strongly that we can get a better way up the mountain here, and that we should protect human embryos in that context. The second issue I brought forward a debate on was the whole rights and needs of victims of human trafficking. I had put down several amendments indeed to the human trafficking legislation, and I brought forward various proposals in the context of a private member's motion. For example, the need to enable victims of human trafficking stay in the country to get the necessary recovery and reflection period. These things are technically provided for, but quite difficult to access. I also support the criminalisation of the purchase of persons in prostitution, as has happened, I believe, quite successfully in Nordic countries.
And the
third issue was end-of-life care. Working with the Irish Hospice Foundation, I brought forward a debate, it was actually the first ever debate in the Oireachtas, to try and pinpoint some of the issues around the need for better quality and a more even spread of quality end-of-life care, not just in our hospitals, of course, but in nursing homes and in homes as well. So those would be the kind of issues, I suppose, I would categorise them as human dignity issues. I have other interests, of course, in the ongoing economic crisis. Education is an area of particular focus for me because I'm involved in the trusteeship of over 100 of our voluntary secondary schools, so I tend to keep an eye on those issues. And I suppose the last point I'd make is, as an independent senator, you're faced with the temptation to speak about everything and to be gabbing on about everything. You're not going to influence the quality of debate if you try that. So I think you've got to, in a sense, pick your themes, your big themes, and then try and be competent on all of the others.
Then try to do everything. Professor John Crown, why are you going for the Seanad? Because you're a very busy man, you're involved in medicine, so for you to make the shift into politics, that's quite a considerable move.
Well, the first reassurance I'd like to offer my patients is I'm not giving up the day job. I will be reining back on some activities which I currently have. I intend taking the Seanad responsibilities extremely seriously if I am elected to them, but I have done the arithmetic and I believe it is possible to balance both careers. I think specifically on that point, the original intent of the Seanad was that it would contain people who were not full-time professional politicians, that it would bring a different skill set within the houses of the Oireachtas than that which is confined purely in a cohort of full-time politicians. But why am I running? I'm running principally on my track record as an advocate for reform and development of the health service. I have been a long-standing, I was a very early and vocal critic of the irrational and unfair nature of our current health system. And I'm delighted to say that many of the ideas which I believe I've put into public debate over the years have been adopted by some of the political parties. And indeed, I find myself largely in agreement with the policies which are being outlined.
As in universal health care for everybody? Yeah.
Yes, I find myself largely in agreement with the policies which have been outlined in the sort of synthesised coalition document from the two pre-election manifestos of Fine Gael and Labour. However, I have a worry about it. Attempting to actually reform the health service right now, and as Senator Mullen has pointed out, we have an absolutely overwhelming financial crisis, a financial crisis, I believe, fed by this mad decision for our country via its taxpayers to set up this massive foreign aid program for crazy speculators in Germany and other countries who thought that investing the money they had responsibility for in Anglo-Irish banks was a good idea. But at this time, it will be very difficult to implement healthcare reform. All of the medical doctors in the current Dáil, good people that they are members of the current leading government party. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to step outside the party whip and to highlight deficiencies in the health service on an ongoing basis.
So are you saying that you don't think that universal health care will be a feasible goal for Fine Gael, for the Fine Gael coalition government to achieve?
I believe it is a feasible goal, but I believe they might need a little bit of prodding on the subject.
And how are you going to do that as an independent senator if you were to be elected in the Dáil?
Well,
what powers do you have to change what policies they are going to start to introduce?
One can only hope that one can call the bluff when things are said which are incorrect, and that one can provide a forum for bringing up within the houses of the Oireachtas deficiencies which otherwise might sound like they're just being hurled and shouted from the sidelines by fans rather than people who are actually participants in the process.
But surely the Seanad, as it has been, and that's the reason why Enda Kenny has said he wants to get rid of it, in his view it doesn't serve a purpose, that it doesn't have that ability to be able to maybe highlight some inconsistencies that actually will lead to legislative change.
With great respect to Taoiseach Kenny, the reason it hasn't is because the original intent of the Seanad has been hijacked by those that have turned it into a chamber, as Senator David Norris has called it, an intensive care unit for failed political careers. And a sort of an incubator for other burgeoning careers. The Seanad was set up, as Senator Mullen has said, to bring a different range of expertise into the House of the Oireachtas, and I believe we can still try and do that. Let me, for the record, state that the Seanad, as currently constructed, is an affront to democracy. And unless it is fundamentally reformed, and I believe it should be reformed not only at Seanad level, but within the context of an overall Oireachtas reform, under those circumstances, if that reform will not happen, I would support its abolition.
Why is it an affront to democracy at the moment?
Well, I mean, for a start, the notion that people who have put themselves in front of the electorate and bravely put themselves in front of the electorate, but who have, and I use the word not judgmentally, been rejected by the electorate, can then be appointed into the Seanad, I think is just simply wrong. I think it is a slap in the face to people that have actually exercised democratic franchise. In addition, the fact that the constituency of the Seanad has been set up, the dominant constituency for the 41 odd seats or whatever that are elected in the panels, has been loaded at present to serve the needs of the political parties. This is not consistent with what the original intent of our Constitution was. And finally, the process that we're taking part in, the election of 6 senators amongst an elite who have been lucky enough to get university education, I believe, is an affront to the people who have not had
Isn't that very true, though, Ronan Mullen? And it's not just all elected graduates. It's only certain graduates, graduates of the NUI system and graduates of the University of Dublin, even those who were coming from other institutions that are now universities, they don't get the opportunity to vote.
I wouldn't disagree with a word that John has said there. In fact, on my very first day in the Seanad, I said that I hoped that at the next election I wouldn't have the embarrassment of meeting with people whose degrees were as good as my own but were not able to vote because of an outdated system stuck back in 1937. And remember, there was a referendum passed in 1979 to allow the broadening of the university constituency so as to include graduates of the newer colleges, the Institutes of Technology sector, with which I'm connected myself, DCU, UL and the others.
They couldn't vote.
Yes, but even if you were to reform that, there is still the very understandable perception of elitism. And the reason for that is that when they brought in the Seanad in 1937, you supposedly have representation for the different vocational sectors, as you know, agriculture, industry and commerce, labour, administrative. But who does the voting? Well, the IFA, or the Thoroughbred Horse Association, can nominate you to run on the agricultural panel, but the people with the votes are actually people like me, outgoing senators, incoming TDs and existing city and county councillors. And that is a recipe for cronyism, it is a recipe for petty corruption, and it is a recipe, in fact, the wonder is that we've had quite a few few senators who came through that corrupt system who were quite good. I think of people like Paul Bradford and Fine Gael, Dr. Martin Manzer, Fianna Fáil, clearly thoughtful people who deserve to be elected representatives. But to be elected in the narrow way they are by an elite constituency is unacceptable. It's a bit like the House of Lords. Somebody said once that the House of Lords often does a very good job, but you could never justify the way they came to be there. And I think the same is true for the Seanad. The one area of maybe slight disagreement, I think, between John and myself, and maybe I haven't fully caught what he's saying, is that I'm just reluctant to limit this label of affront to democracy to the Seanad itself. There is a problem with our political system in a way that's much wider than the Seanad. And to present Seanad, the abolition of the Seanad, as the political reform we need is really to insult people's intelligence. I'm not saying you're doing this, by the way, John. It would be really to insult people's intelligence. Because if you look at the way our Dáil operates, we have 166 TDs, probably far too many. We could probably do with 100 TDs and 50 senators, to be truthful. 166 TDs, most of them focused on local issues, and they will not go against the party whip on all but the most pressing of issues for them personally, because they risk losing advancement or the possibility of advancement if they do. So what I'm saying is we need to reform our political system to strengthen the parliamentary dimension of our democracy against the executive.
That's just what I said. I mean, and as I recall, I said a few minutes ago that I would reform the Seanad within the context of overall Oireachtas reform, because the Dáil desperately needs to be reformed. And indeed, without going into all the arcane details, the specifics of what I thought would be a reasonable outline of a plan for constitutional and parliamentary reform in this country would have to recognise two realities. That in a democracy you need to elect a chamber of people who are focused on national issues, who are not overly distracted by relentlessly local and parochial issues. But by the same token, one should not be condescending about those local and parochial issues. People do need to feel that they have a connection to their government. So I believe we should have the more powerful lower house. The Dáil is currently constituted, should be elected on the basis of a national list or some version of a national list, which would elect people who actually were focused on the big picture, and at the same time to have a universal suffrage based, smaller, trimmed down upper house with more of an oversight role, which is constitutionally probably slightly jury-rigged in such a way to minimise the chance of parliamentary deadlock, which can occur if you've got widely divergent opinions in the two houses, but which is based on some type of local constituency electoral
Okay, but
system.
isn't it the case that if that is really to work, the senators need to be sitting for much longer? I mean, the amount of time that you actually sit, Ronan Mullen, is not that much. You can continue to have other jobs. And even full-time jobs.
Yes, many of them do. And but even at that, you'd have to look at how it has worked out. I mean, we had there was at least one occasion there towards the end of the last term when the opposition, if you like, pulled the plug on the government when the Greens ran out. We had a date set for the general election in March. Now look what happened. The opposition saw their opportunity to embarrass the government even more, so they forced an earlier general election. In doing so, they did not want, however, the election to happen without the finance bill being passed, because in that finance bill were the various tough decisions that they knew they'd have to take anyway. So we were presented with this spectacle of a 2-day debate, I think it was, in the Dáil on something as important as the finance bill, and a 2-day debate in the Seanad on the finance bill, and we all clapped ourselves on the back for going in on Saturday, when in fact the travesty was that it laid bare the cynicism about our parliamentary structure, that he said, you know what, when push comes to shove and for some other political advantage we can really truncate some of the most important legislation into a couple of days debate.
Okay.
And that really showed the cynicism about our political system and the way the parliamentary dimension of it works.
Okay, Professor John Crown, again the point that this should be a full-time job. You're saying that you could easily do a job as a senator and actually your very heavy workload that you do.
If there are people who believe that the Senate should be comprised of full-time politicians as currently constructed, don't vote for me.